Millionaire suspected the maid until security cameras showed the impossible with his deaf twins. Ricardo Moreira's mansion was so vast that even its own sounds echoed within it. The long hallways, high ceilings, large glass doors overlooking a perfectly trimmed garden, all of it carried the cold luxury of a place that had once been very happy, but now held only emptiness. Since the day Helena passed away, this house had never truly come back to life. Ricardo kept everything exactly the same. The interior unchanged, family photographs still hanging on the walls, the clock still running on time. But one thing had disappeared forever: laughter. And that silence became heavier when the two children in the house could not hear. Theo and Daniel grew up in a world of gestures, glances, and frustrations that could not be named. 3 years old, an age that should have been full of questions, babbling sounds, and innocent calls of Dad. But instead, there were tantrums, objects being thrown, and helpless looks when no one could understand what they were trying to say. Ricardo had hired 6 maids in just a few months. Some quit after a week. Some could not endure the children's soundless screams. Some showed too much pity, the thing Ricardo hated most. He did not need sympathetic looks for his children. He needed efficiency, order, and distance. Ricardo did not believe in emotion at work, just as he did not believe in luck. Ricardo still remembered that interview very clearly. Not because it was special, but because it was so ordinary, an ordinariness rarely found in a house long accustomed to tension and disappointment. Clara Nunes arrived on time, not early, not late. She wore dark jeans, a simple shirt, her hair neatly tied back. No makeup, no attempt to impress. She stood in front of the large gate of the Moreira mansion with a calmness that caught Ricardo's attention. Those before her had either been overwhelmed or visibly submissive. Clara was neither. She simply waited, her hands loosely folded in front of her, her gaze observing as if memorizing the space around her. The interview was brief. Ricardo asked the familiar questions: work experience, schedule, ability to stay long-term. Clara answered concisely and clearly. No rambling, no unnecessary explanations. When Ricardo mentioned Theo and Daniel, 2 deaf children, he waited for the familiar reaction: a frown, a look of pity, or an awkward hesitation poorly concealed. But Clara only nodded. No pity, no surprise. Just a very slight nod, as if it were information she had already known. That moment made Ricardo frown faintly, but he quickly dismissed it. He was far too used to reading too much into small details. The conversation was nearly over when Theo and Daniel ran into the living room. The 2 children rushed past the sofa, knocking over a few cushions, giggling in their own way. Soundless noises, only heavy breaths, and expressive faces. Ricardo braced himself for the familiar scene. The prospective maid would hesitate, stand up, or find an excuse to leave. But Clara did not. She slowly sat down on the floor, at eye level with the children. She did not call their names. She did not touch them. She simply began to move her hands. Simple, gentle gestures, not following any system of sign language Ricardo had ever known. Theo stopped first, then Daniel. In just a few dozen seconds, the 2 children, usually so chaotic, sat down facing Clara, watching her every movement as if hypnotized. Ricardo stood frozen. He had never seen this happen before. No one, not even those experienced with special needs children, had ever managed to hold the boy's attention for more than a few seconds. Clara then stood up as if nothing remarkable had just occurred and returned to finish the interview. Ricardo asked no further questions. He could not explain the feeling rising in his chest either. He knew only one thing: the decision to hire Clara was made immediately. Clara's first days at work passed with a suspicious calm. The mansion had never been so clean. The floors were always polished, the furniture arranged in its proper place, the kitchen so orderly that Ricardo could find no reason to complain. Clara worked quietly, on time, asked little, and did not interfere in the homeowner's decisions. From a rational standpoint, she was the perfect maid. But it was precisely that perfection that unsettled Ricardo. He began to notice a small but recurring detail: time. Clara spent too much time with Theo and Daniel. Not the usual kind of care, feeding them, changing clothes, watching over them, but long periods sitting on the floor, sharing the same space with the children, observing them as if waiting for something. At first, Ricardo told himself it was dedication. Then he realized it was intention. Clara often carried very unusual objects: a small bell taken from a decorative shelf, an old toy drum from the storage room, sometimes just 2 wooden spoons lightly tapping against the side of a pot. She did not make noise. Everything was gentle, rhythmic, repeated with steady regularity. Ricardo watched from a distance, then from closer by, and finally from his office through the camera system he had almost never used since Helena's death. On the screen, Clara sat between the 2 children. Her hands moved slowly, rhythmically. It was not the standard sign language Ricardo had once learned in classes for parents of hearing-impaired children. These gestures were simpler, almost instinctive. But what made Ricardo shiver was Theo and Daniel's reaction. They focused, not the fleeting attention typical of 3-year-olds, but deep, sustained concentration. Their eyes followed every movement, their bodies gradually relaxed. The tantrums noticeably decreased when Clara was near. Ricardo began recording the times, saving the clips, naming the files by date and hour, the same way he did with financial reports. He told himself it was just a professional habit, but the truth was, he could not stop watching. One afternoon, while Ricardo was watching the living room camera, Clara opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside were Helena's personal belongings, a few old items Ricardo had never had the courage to put away. Clara took out a small music box. Ricardo held his breath. Clara held the box in her hands for a long time, as if weighing something. Then she opened the lid. The melody played, a sound so familiar it hurt. Ricardo felt his chest tighten. It was the music box Helena used to play when lulling the children to sleep. On the screen, Clara closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek. Ricardo sprang to his feet. Anger surged violently. How did she know where that box was? How dared she touch something so private? He was about to leave his office and confront her immediately, but then he stopped. If Clara truly had something to hide, a hasty reaction would only make everything close in tighter. Ricardo returned to his desk and sat back down in front of the screen. The recording continued. Clara placed the box back exactly where it had been, as carefully as she had taken it out. The drawer was closed. Not a single unnecessary movement. The room returned to emptiness, as if nothing had ever happened. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, the sense of unease creeping in more clearly than before. He was no longer sure whether he was watching to protect his children or to find an answer to a question that was becoming increasingly disturbing. Clara was not acting like a curious person, and that was what truly worried him. By the second week, that behavior not only failed to diminish, but became systematic. Clara spent more time in the children's room. The door was always left slightly ajar. She arranged objects in a specific order, used her hands to signal, changed her facial expressions, and kept rhythm through slow, deliberate movements. Ricardo began saving every recording, categorizing them by day and hour. At night, he replayed each clip, pausing at brief moments, trying to decipher the intention behind every movement. There was nothing random about it. Clara was not behaving like a devoted maid. She seemed to be pursuing something more private, deeper, a goal unrelated to cleaning or daily routines. Ricardo began to lose sleep. He woke in the middle of the night, opened his laptop, and replayed the recordings from the previous day. During meetings, he was distracted. His assistant noticed the change, but Ricardo offered no explanation. To him, everything else had become secondary. The truth, whatever it was, needed to be exposed. By the end of the second week, Ricardo made a decision. On Saturday morning, he announced that he would be leaving Recife for work and would only return the following evening. Clara replied almost immediately, "Yes, I'll take care of everything." The next day, he locked himself in his office, turned on the surveillance system, made coffee, and waited. Clara arrived on time, as she did every day. The morning passed normally. Meals, bathing, cleaning, nothing out of the ordinary. Ricardo even began to feel that he might be going too far. Until around 10 o'clock. On the storage room screen, Clara pulled out a large box Ricardo had never seen before. From inside, she took out children's musical instruments, maracas, a small drum, bells, and a toy keyboard. Ricardo leaned forward, his heart beginning to race. When had she brought them into the house? In the playroom, Clara arranged the instruments in a circle. Theo and Daniel were seated in the middle. She began to play each one, not fast, not forcefully, each sound followed by a clear pause. Ricardo clenched his fists. Theo touched the keyboard. Daniel shook the maracas, smiling brightly. Ricardo tried to convince himself it was just a visual reaction. Children imitate things all the time. There was nothing here. But then, in the afternoon, it happened. Clara and the children were sitting and playing with wooden blocks. Theo had his back to her. There was no hand movement, no signaling gesture. Clara suddenly clapped her hands once, very hard. Ricardo felt the blood in his body freeze. Theo turned his head, not slowly, not off target, but directly toward Clara. Ricardo sprang up from his chair. He replayed the video, then replayed it again, and again. He watched that clip more than 20 times, searching for any element that could be rationally explained. There was none. Clara was standing behind Theo. There was no visual stimulus, no obvious floor vibration, only sound. Ricardo stepped back, his back against the wall. For 2 years, he had trusted the medical diagnoses completely, believed his children would live in silence forever, believed there were no miracles. But that video did not care about his beliefs. In the afternoon, Clara moved to the living room. She turned on the sound system, not loud, just enough to create rhythm. She held the children's hands and moved with them. Theo and Daniel laughed, spun around, responded with their whole bodies. Ricardo could clearly see that joy, real, unforced. Then he saw Clara's tears. She cried in silence, still keeping the rhythm, still holding the children as if she did not want the moment to disappear. It was not pain, not exhaustion. It was the expression of a belief being confirmed. That sent a chill down Ricardo's spine. Clara was not just emotionally attached to his children, she was seeing something he could not see. When the children fell asleep, Ricardo replayed the morning recording, then again and again. He stopped at a very small moment. When Theo reacted at the exact moment, a vibration was created. The coincidence repeated too many times to be ignored. For the first time since Helena's death, Ricardo allowed himself to question not the woman he was suspicious of, but the conclusions he had trusted for all these years. On Monday morning, Ricardo canceled all his meetings. He gave no explanation to anyone. He simply called his secretary and asked for every appointment to be postponed indefinitely. At that moment, there was no room in his mind for contracts or numbers. There was only one image repeating over and over. Theo turning his head at the sound of a clap. Ricardo took his sons to the largest private clinic in Recife, a place he had brought them to many times before. The doctors were familiar faces, white corridors, the smell of antiseptic, questions that had been answered far too many times. The tests were conducted again from the beginning. Hearing measurements, reflex checks. Charts appeared on the screen with cold, indifferent curves. Ricardo sat behind the one-way glass, his hands tightly clasped together, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. 3 hours later, the head physician called him into a private room. "There is no change, Mr. Moreira," he said in the firm voice of someone accustomed to delivering difficult conclusions. "Theo and Daniel still have profound sensorineural deafness in both ears. The results are completely consistent with the previous tests." Ricardo felt his throat go dry. He took out his phone, opened the video he had watched countless times, and placed it on the desk. "Then how do you explain this?" The doctor watched very carefully, paused, slowed it down, watched it again. Then he let out a light breath as if he had found a reasonable explanation. "Hearing-impaired children often develop very strong compensatory senses," he said. "Vibrations from the floor, changes in air pressure, even the perception of very slight movement behind them. The child's brain can interpret those signals as reflexes." Reason, science, familiar words that Ricardo had clung to for 3 years. He nodded, thanked him, shook hands, took his children home. But on the drive back, Ricardo realized something frightening. For the first time, he no longer felt comforted by science's answers, because if it was only vibration, then why was Theo's reaction so precise? Why did the boy's eyes find the exact direction? Why did everything happen with a rhythm that Ricardo could not dismiss as coincidence? Science said one thing. What he had seen said the opposite. When the car stopped in front of the mansion gates, Ricardo remained seated for a long time, his hands still on the steering wheel. Inside the house, Clara was preparing lunch. Everything looked completely normal. But for Ricardo, the world had begun to crack. He was no longer sure what was real, only that the woman standing in the kitchen held a truth he did not yet understand, and that he was about to face it directly. That afternoon, Ricardo called Clara into the living room. It was not a commanding tone, nor was it his usual calm voice. Just a short sentence, low and dry, enough for Clara to understand that this was not an ordinary conversation. The children were playing in the next room. The door was closed. The vast space of the living room suddenly became suffocating. Ricardo stood with his arms crossed over his chest. Clara sat on the sofa, her back straight, her hands neatly resting on her knees. She remained silent, as if she had anticipated this moment for a long time. "I want you to explain," Ricardo began, his voice restrained but tense. "The instruments, the sounds, the things you've been doing with my children." Clara looked up, her gaze unwavering. "What exactly are you referring to?" Ricardo played the video on his phone and placed it on the table. The sound of the clap echoed in the quiet room. The image of Theo turning his head appeared clearly, undeniable. "This," Ricardo said, his voice rising. "Explain this to me." Clara stared at the screen for a long time. No panic, no surprise, just a very light exhale, as if the moment had finally come. "How many times have you watched it?" she asked softly. Ricardo froze. "You have no right to ask me that." "You've watched it enough to know it isn't random," Clara replied. "And you also know what the doctor said. That's why you called me in here." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Ricardo stepped forward. "Who do you think you are to do those things with my children? Do you think you know more than the doctors? Or are you just a maid who thinks she understands what science has already concluded?" The words fell into the room like a blow. For a brief moment, Clara said nothing. Then she stood up. For the first time since she had entered this house, Ricardo saw anger clearly in her eyes. "I know," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "I know because I lived it." Ricardo frowned. "What?" "I was also diagnosed with profound deafness," Clara continued, "from a very young age. They said I would never hear anything, that every effort would be useless." Ricardo stiffened. "But they were wrong," Clara said, her eyes never leaving his. Not completely wrong, but they didn't look deep enough. She spoke of the ability to sense low-frequency vibrations, of very deep sounds the body perceives before the ears do, of how she recognized those signs in Theo and Daniel's eyes, the focus, the precise reactions, the familiar rhythm. "I'm not saying they can hear like normal people," Clara said, "but they are not completely in silence." Ricardo shook his head. 3 doctors, 3 tests. Are you saying all of them are wrong?" "I'm saying they've never encountered a case like this," Clara replied. "And I also know you won't believe me." Ricardo clenched his jaw. "Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because they are children," Clara said, her voice softening. "And because if I stay silent, you will repeat the very mistake my family once made." The room fell into a heavy silence. Ricardo looked at the woman before him, no longer a timid maid, but someone carrying a truth too large, too dangerous to ignore. The days that followed passed with a completely different rhythm. The house did not change in appearance, but the atmosphere inside did. Ricardo no longer avoided moments close to his children. He began to observe more, not through cameras, but through his own presence. And for the first time, he allowed Clara to remain in that space, no longer as a maid under suspicion, but as a silent companion. Ricardo contacted a rare hearing specialist in São Paulo, someone Clara had once heard mentioned within the very small community of special cases like hers. The call lasted nearly an hour. Ricardo spoke little, mostly listened. Clara, for the first time, was able to speak about her experience, not to defend herself, but to explain. The doctor made no promises. He said only one sentence that Ricardo remembered. "If there is even a partial ability to perceive sound vibrations, then proper stimulation can make a difference." The following week, they took Theo and Daniel for specialized examinations. There were no blind expectations, only a very small hope, placed carefully like something fragile. The tests proceeded slowly and meticulously, focusing on extremely low frequencies, things standard examinations had never measured. The results were not a miracle, but they were not zero either. Theo and Daniel responded to vibrations, not clearly, not consistently, but genuinely. A personalized therapy program was designed, low-frequency drums, vibrating surfaces, steady rhythm. Everything progressed so slowly that Ricardo sometimes had to remind himself to be patient. There were no grand promises, only small improvements, a gaze that lingered longer, a more precise reflex. And through all of those moments, Clara was always there. She did not just guide, she observed, adjusted, waited, as if she were reading a language no one else could see. To Theo and Daniel, Clara was not a teacher, she was someone who understood. Ricardo began to look at Clara differently, no longer with wariness, no longer with suspicion, but with a feeling difficult to name, both gratitude and unease. He realized that without Clara, he might have missed the only chance to see his children's world open, even by the narrowest crack. Hope was not loud. It arrived very slowly. But for the first time in 2 years, Ricardo felt that he was no longer standing still in his grief. He was moving forward. The days that followed passed with a completely different rhythm. The house did not change in appearance, but the atmosphere inside did. Ricardo no longer avoided moments close to his children. He began to observe more, not through cameras, but through his own presence. And for the first time, he allowed Clara to remain in that space, no longer as a maid under suspicion, but as a silent companion. Ricardo contacted a rare hearing specialist in São Paulo, someone Clara had once heard mentioned within the very small community of special cases like hers. The call lasted nearly an hour. Ricardo spoke little, mostly listened. Clara, for the first time, was able to speak about her experience not to defend herself, but to explain. The doctor made no promises. He said only one sentence that Ricardo remembered. If there is even a partial ability to perceive sound vibrations, then proper stimulation can make a difference. The following week, they took Theo and Daniel for specialized examinations. There were no blind expectations, only a very small hope, placed carefully like something fragile. The tests proceeded slowly and meticulously, focusing on extremely low frequencies, things standard examinations had never measured. The results were not a miracle, but they were not zero either. Theo and Daniel responded to vibrations, not clearly, not consistently, but genuinely. A personalized therapy program was designed. Low-frequency drums, vibrating surfaces, steady rhythm. Everything progressed so slowly that Ricardo sometimes had to remind himself to be patient. There were no grand promises, only small improvements, a gaze that lingered longer, a more precise reflex. And through all of those moments, Clara was always there. She did not just guide, she observed, adjusted, waited, as if she were reading a language no one else could see. To Theo and Daniel, Clara was not a teacher. She was someone who understood. Ricardo began to look at Clara differently, no longer with wariness, no longer with suspicion, but with a feeling difficult to name, both gratitude and unease. He realized that without Clara, he might have missed the only chance to see his children's world open, even by the narrowest crack. 2 years passed, quietly, the same way grief had once withdrawn from that house. Ricardo Moreira's mansion no longer carried the appearance of a place struggling just to survive. It breathed. It lived. On autumn mornings, gentle sunlight poured through the windows of the playroom, where Theo and Daniel were now older, taller, their eyes deeper and far calmer. They still did not speak much, but they could feel the world. Until one autumn afternoon that year, a day that seemed entirely ordinary. Clara had just stepped through the doorway when both children suddenly burst into tears. Not the familiar soundless cries of years past, but trembling, violent sobs, as if something inside them had just shattered. Clara panicked and dropped to her knees, wrapping both children in her arms. "It's okay. I'm here." And then, in a moment that left the entire house frozen, Theo's lips trembled. A very small sound escaped, not a full word, not clear in meaning, but a sound. Daniel trembled as well, his lips parting, releasing a faint, fragile noise. Clara broke down in tears. Ricardo stood frozen behind them, his heart seeming to stop. He dropped to his knees beside his children, his hands trembling as he placed them on their shoulders, unable to believe what he had just heard. Real sound, not vibration, not reflex. The doctors later could not believe the results either. The examinations were long, the measurements repeated again and again, and then a conclusion that left everyone silent. Theo and Daniel had partially regained their hearing naturally. No one could explain why. There was no clear medical miracle, only a hypothesis that the right stimulation at the right time, combined with the remarkable adaptability of a young child's brain, had opened a door once believed to be permanently closed. In that joy, Ricardo realized another truth, slowly but impossible to deny. He loved Clara, not a blazing love, but a feeling that had grown over time, through exhausting nights, long therapy sessions, shared silences in fear, and shared smiles over small hope. One autumn evening, Ricardo knelt in front of Clara, a ring trembling slightly in his hand. "I don't know what the future will be like," he said, "but I know I don't want to keep going without you." Clara cried, and she nodded. The day they stood before Helena's grave, the autumn wind moved gently through the trees. Theo and Daniel stood between them, holding both their hands. Ricardo placed a bouquet of white flowers down and spoke softly. "Thank you for leading the way." Clara closed her eyes, tears falling freely, but her smile was peaceful. Somewhere in the quiet of autumn, Helena seemed to smile, The wedding did not take place on a date marked as special on any calendar. It arrived on a very ordinary spring afternoon, when the garden behind the Moreira mansion had just begun to turn green again after years of cold silence. The walls no longer held their breath. The house no longer felt like it was bracing itself against loss. For the first time in years, the mansion exhaled. Ricardo stood at the end of the stone path, his hands tightening briefly before relaxing. He was no longer a man afraid of losing something else. What remained in him now was gratitude. Gratitude for still being here, for still having the courage to move forward. When Clara appeared, everything around them seemed to slow. Her wedding dress was simple. No glitter, no excess. Soft white fabric, flowing naturally, just like her. A spring breeze lifted the hem slightly, as if the dress itself were breathing. When her eyes met Ricardo's, no promises were spoken. The most important promises had already been lived, quietly, day by day. When it was time to exchange the rings, the garden fell into a deep, sacred stillness. Theo and Daniel stepped forward. The two boys wore tiny suits, their small hands clutching the velvet ring box as if afraid to drop something fragile beyond words. Their steps were hesitant, their focus unwavering. No one rushed them, no one interrupted. Even the world seemed to understand that this moment needed its own time. They stood before Clara and Ricardo. Daniel looked up first, his lips trembling. A small sound escaped, unfinished, unclear, but real. Ricardo's throat tightened instantly. Theo opened the box. The rings lay still inside, silent, as if waiting. They handed them over. Ricardo knelt, resting his hands on his son's shoulders. In that moment, the years of doubt, the sleepless nights watching security footage, the fear that his children would live forever in silence, all of it faded. All that remained were two small hands, trembling with effort and love. The applause came softly, not loud, not grand, but full. After the wedding, time began to move differently, no longer with the urgency of fear, no longer with the stillness of grief, but with the rhythm of healing. Theo and Daniel grew slowly. Therapy sessions stretched long, afternoons filled with low, steady drumbeats, repetition that exhausted the body, days with no progress, days that felt like starting over. And then, small openings. The first sounds were imperfect, fragile, unclear, but they were real. "Dad? Mom?" Each time, Ricardo turned away quickly, not from shame, but because he had never learned how to remain standing in the presence of happiness. Then Anna arrived, a small girl born into a home that had relearned how to love. Her cries did not bring chaos, they brought life. Each nighttime waking, each gentle breath, was proof that this house no longer feared sound. Theo and Daniel loved their little sister in their own quiet way. They did not speak much, but they sat close. They watched. They touched her tiny hands with a care that spoke louder than words. That afternoon, sunlight stretched across the lawn. Theo and Daniel sat on a blanket, each holding Anna in their arms. Their movements were slow, careful. Their eyes steady. Anna slept peacefully, her face calm and trusting. Ricardo stood behind them, his arms wrapped around Clara. He rested his forehead against her hair. No words were needed. The past did not need to be named. Before them stood two boys who had once lived in silence, now protecting their sister with everything they had. Behind them lay the years of loss, finally set down. This family was not built by a miracle. It was built by patience, by listening, by people who chose not to give up. And in that gentle light, Ricardo understood something simple at last. Some happiness does not arrive with loud applause. It arrives quietly, and it stays.